with 19,000 of his sheep
first
were cruelly
and
butchered.
then beheaded with an axe, AD 168.
Justinus, first scourged and then
Polycarp,
beheaded
a
with an
disciple
axe,
of the
AD
Apostle
168.
John, and pastor of the church at Smyrna,
Polycarp,
put to death
a disciple
with
of the
fire
Apostle
and
John,
sword,
and
AD
pastor of the
168.
church at Smyrna, put to death
12
with fire and
Christians who had
sword,
come from
AD
Philadelphia to
168.
Smyrna, put to death on the same
12
day
Christians
with
who had come
Polycarp
from Philadelphia
in AD
to Smyrna,
168.
put to death on the same
Philemon
day
J. Van
with
Brogg
Polycarp
writes,
in AD
or
168.
quotes rather, A.
Philemon J. Van Brogg writes,
These are the
or
particulars
quotes
of the
rather,
martyrdom of
A.
Polycarp,
Malinus,
who had come from
these are
Philadelphia
the
to Smyrna
particulars of
together
the
with 12
martyrdom
others,
of
who
Polycarp,
willingly
who had
suffered
come
death
from
in
Philadelphia
the
to
same
Smyrna
manner with
together
him,
with 12 others,
whose
who
names
willingly
are
suffered
not
death in
mentioned,
the
that
same
of
manner
Polycarp
with him,
alone being given.
whose names
Because not only
not
among the
mentioned,
Christians,
that of
but even
Polycarp
among the
alone
Jews
being
and the
given.
heathen, he was
Because not
famous
only
far
among
and
the
wide
Christians, but
for
even
his
among the Jews and the
extraordinary
heathen,
godliness.
he was famous far and
These
wide
testimonies are
for his
finished and
extraordinary
sealed with the
godliness.
precious blood of the Christians.
These testimonies are finished and sealed with the
Carpus,
precious blood of the
Papulus,
Christians.
Agathonica, and many other women
Carpus,
put to death at
Papulus,
Pergamus, about
Agathonica,
168.
and many other women put to death at
Germanicus,
Pergamus, about
devoured by
168.
beasts at Smyrna, AD 170.
Germanicus,
Vetulus,
devoured by beasts
surnamed
at Smyrna,
Agathus,
AD
put to death
170.
on the river
Vetulus,
Rhone in France,
surnamed
about AD
Agathus,
172.
put to death on the
Attalus,
river Rhone
roasted
in France,
iron
about
chair,
AD
cast before the
172.
wild beasts,
Attalus,
his throat cut,
roasted in
and
an
beheaded
iron chair,
on the river
cast
Rhone,
before the wild
about
beast, his
172.
throat cut and beheaded
Van Brogg
on the
writes
river
that
Rhone,
there were
about
several others that were
172.
martyred with him.
Van Brogg writes that there were several others that
Alexander
were
of
martyred
Phrygia,
with him.
first tortured and then executed with the sword.
Alexander of
on the river Rhone,
Phrygia,
about
first
172.
tortured and then executed with the
It is
sword
said that he was
on
a
the river
physician
Rhone, about
and was executed
172.
the same day.
It is said that he was a
Attalus
physician
and other
and
Christians.
was executed the same day and
Maturus
place as
Sanctus
Attalus and other
Blandina
Christians.
and a youth from Pontus.
Maturus
tormented on the river
Sanctus
Rhone,
Blandina
about
and a youth from Pontus, tormented on the
Several
river
ancient
Rhone,
writers
about
mention a man of
172.
90 years old named
Several
Photinus,
ancient writers mention
who
a
was
man of
teacher
90
in the
years
church at
old
Lyons,
named
France,
Photinus,
being terribly
who was a
tortured,
teacher
even
of the
though
church
he
at
was
Lyons,
unable to
France. Being terribly tortured,
He survived
even
the
though
torture,
he was
but
unable
died
to
in
walk.
prison 2 days later.
He survived the
about
torture,
179.
but died in prison 2 days later. This was about 179.
Alcibiades, martyred at Lyons in France about 179.
Alcibiades,
It is believed
martyred
that
at
Attalus
Lyons
was
in
his
France
pastor.
about 179. It is believed that
Epipodus of
Attalus was
Lyons
his
and
pastor.
Alexander, a Greek, martyred at Lyons in France.
Epipodus of Lyons
The one
and
beheaded
Alexander,
and the other
a Greek,
crucified,
martyred at Lyons in
179.
France. The one beheaded and the other crucified,
Leonidas and
179.
Plutarchus and others put to death about 180.
Leonidas
We're
and
not told
Plutarchus
just
and
where
others
these died.
put to death about 180. We're not told just where these
persecution was
died.
so great that according to ancient writers,
This
it
period of
caused an
persecution was so
and
great
terrible
that according to
pestilence
ancient writers,
that
it caused
devastated
an
countries and
unexpected
inhabitants,
and terrible
especially
pestilence
Italy.
that devastated countries and inhabitants,
It was so horrible that the
especially
Christians
Italy.
were forgotten. It is recorded that
It was so
many
horrible
villages
that
had
the
been
Christians
so
were forgotten.
greatly affected that
It is
they
recorded
became
that many
completely
villages had been so
lay
greatly
waste
affected
and empty.
that they became completely
Those
depopulated
listed
and lay
previously
waste
were not the
and
only ones that
empty.
were martyred. There were
Those
hundreds
listed
of
previously
others
were not
who
the
were
only
named.
ones that were martyred. There were hundreds
Let's
of
look at a
others
summary of the
who were not
martyrs of the
named.
3rd century.
Let's look at a summary of the martyrs of the 3rd century.
Brogg writes, there never was
Philemon
a time
J.
in the Church of Jesus
Van
Christ
Brogg
in which so
writes,
many
there
and
never
great
was a
tyrants
time in the Church of
arose to
Jesus
destroy
Christ
and
in which so
exterminate
many
the
and
people
great
of God
tyrants
as in
arose
this
to
century.
destroy and extirpate
For
the people
scarcely
of
had
God,
one ceased
as in this
when another
century.
began, excepting a
For
short
scarcely had
cessation
one ceased
under the
when
emperors
another began,
Caracalla and
excepting a short
Geta.
cessation under the emperors
He then
Caracalla
begins to name
and
several
Geta.
different emperors who, quote,
He then
though the
begins
world
to
hailed
name
them
several
as
different
gracious
emperors
emperors,
who, quote,
were indeed
though the
nothing
world
less
hailed
than
them as
unmerciful,
gracious
cruel,
emperors,
and
were
bloodthirsty
indeed nothing
tyrants.
less than unmerciful, cruel,
Under
and
these
bloodthirsty
emperors
tyrants.
died several thousand Christians.
Under
who were not
these
named at all.
emperors died several
there were many
thousand
others
Christians who were not named at all.
among whom was
Yet
Origen.
there were many others who
Origen
were
was not a
named,
pastor,
among
but
whom was
supposedly a
Origen.
Christian who was a very
Origen
copious
was not a
writer.
pastor,
The
but
Catholics
supposedly
took
a
his
Christian
name as
who was
one
a
of
very
their early
copious writer.
adherents.
The Catholics
A
took
quick
his
look at
name
some of
as
his
one of
beliefs
their
causes
early
me to think
adherents.
that he was not sound
A
doctrinally.
quick look at some of his beliefs
Regardless,
causes me
history
to think that
records
he was
him
not
as
sound
one of the
doctrinally.
quote-unquote Christians
Regardless,
that ran
history
afoul of the
records
Roman
him
Empire
as one of the
and died
quote-unquote
because of it.
Christians that ran afoul of the Roman
The
Empire
fifth
and
persecution
died
was
because of
supposedly
it.
started under the Emperor
The fifth persecution was supposedly started under the Emperor L. Septimus
The most violent
Severus
persecution
and
of this
started
time
about
was in
201.
Egypt and
The
Africa.
most violent persecution of this time
Great
was in
multitudes of
Egypt
Christians
and
were brought
Africa.
to Alexandria from Egypt.
Great
where they were
multitudes
put to
of
death
Christians
in many
were brought
ways.
to Alexandria
Yes, I know.
from
Alexandria
Egypt, where
is
they were
in
put to death in
northern
many ways.
Egypt on the coast of the
Yes, I know.
Mediterranean Sea.
Alexandria is in
Egypt is a lot
northern
more
Egypt
than
on
just
the coast of the
Alexandria.
Mediterranean Sea.
And so the Christians
But
were
Egypt
brought
is
from
a
all
lot
parts
more
of
than
Egypt
just
to
Alexandria.
where they
And so the Christians were brought from all parts of Egypt to Alexandria,
Rutulus,
where they
after
were
many
put to death.
escapes, torn asunder and then burned.
Rutulus,
sometime
after many
about
escapes,
210.
torn asunder and then
somewhere in
burned,
Africa.
sometime
Considering
about
the
210,
context of
somewhere
Philemon J.
in
Van
Africa.
Van
Considering
Brogg's
the
writing,
context
I
of
suspect that the
Philemon
year
J.
was
Van
probably 201.
Van Brogg's writing,
Not
I
210.
suspect that the year was probably 201
Mavillus
and not
of
210.
Adrumelin, torn by wild beasts.
Mavillus
Carthage,
of
about
Adrumelin,
201.
torn by wild
Perpetua
beasts, that
and
Carthage,
Felicitas
about
of
201.
Cherburbe in
Perpetua
Marietana,
and
and
Felicitas
others
of
violently
Cherburbe
put to death
in
about
Marietana
201.
and others
Marietania is in
violently
Africa.
put to death about 201.
Leonidas, the
Marietania
father of
is in
Origen,
Africa.
beheaded at Alexandria. in
Leonidas,
Egypt,
the
about
father of
202.
Origen, beheaded at
5
Alexandria.
disciples of
in
Origen
Egypt,
put to
about
death at
202.
Alexandria in Egypt.
5
about
disciples of
203.
Origen put to death at
2
Alexandria
female
in
disciples
Egypt,
of Origen
about 203.
burned alive at Alexandria.
2 female
about
disciples of
204.
Origen burned alive at
Basilides,
Alexandria,
who had been
about
an
204.
executioner, became a Christian because of the death of a
Basilides,
martyr.
who had been an executioner,
Beheaded at
became a
Alexandria
Christian because of the death of a martyr. He was beheaded at Alexandria about 204.
After many torments, put to death at Lyons,
Irenaeus,
France, about
after
210.
many torments, put to death
Irenaeus was born
at
in Smyrna
Lyons in France, about
and was a
210.
disciple of
Irenaeus
Polycarp.
was born in Smyrna
He became the pastor
and was a
of the church
disciple
at Lyons
of Polycarp.
in the place of Photinus.
He became the pastor of the church at Lyons.
This
in
particular
the
period
place
of
of
persecution
Photinus.
came to an end when Severus,
This particular
after
period
reigning
of
for 18
persecution
years,
came
was
to an
succeeded by
end
his 2 sons.
when Severus,
Even though
after
they
reigning
were
for 18
reportedly
years, was succeeded by his 2 sons.
cruel, and bloodthirsty.
Even though they were
did not
reportedly
bother
unmerciful, cruel, and
Tertullian writes
bloodthirsty,
that
did
it
not
cease
bother the
entirely,
Christians.
but it still was a
Tertullian
desirable
writes
time
that it did not
when
cease
compared
entirely,
with
but
the
it still
preceding
was a
severe
desirable
and bloody
time
persecution.
when compared with the preceding severe
Around the year
and bloody
223,
persecutions.
the persecution was reinstituted
Around the
under
year
Alexander
223,
Severus.
the persecution
There were
was
many
reinstituted
put to
under
death
Alexander
in Rome
Severus.
that same year.
There were many put to death in Rome
the sixth
that same
persecution
year.
that started under Maximin A.D. 237.
Now let's look at the sixth persecution that started
Several
under
thousand
Maximin
people burned
AD
in their meeting
237.
places on different occasions.
Several
by the
thousand
command of
people
Maximin
burned in their meeting
about
places on
237.
different occasions
According to
by
history,
the command of
emperor sent his
Maximin
soldiers
about
when the
237.
Christians were assembled. in
According
their
to
houses of
history, the
worship,
emperor sent his
locked them
soldiers
in.
when the
Wood
Christians
piled
were
all
assembled
around
in their
the meeting
houses of
place and
worship,
set fire,
locked them
causing
in,
all
wood
therein
piled
to be
all
burned
around
to
the
death.
meeting place
None
and
of
set
them
fire,
are mentioned.
causing all therein to be burned
Some
to death.
60 others
None
put
of
to
them
death under
are
the reign of
mentioned by
Maximin
name.
in 239.
Some 60 others put to death under the reign
Alexander
of
of the
Maximin
Church of
in
Jerusalem, after
239.
many torments, put to death at Jerusalem.
Alexander of
and
the
many
Church
others
of
in
Jerusalem,
different
after
places,
many
put to
torments,
death in AD
put to death at
247.
Jerusalem, and many others in different places,
Let's
put
consider
to
the
death in
seventh
AD
persecution that began
247.
under Decius in 251.
Let's consider the seventh persecution that began
Concerning
under
the
Decius
cruelty and
in
misery of this
251.
persecution. Philemon
Concerning
J.
the
Van Borg
cruelty and
quotes
misery of this
historian
persecution,
P.J. Twessy.
Philemon J. Van Borg quotes
He
historian
caused
P.J.
public
Twessy.
mandates and decrees
Quote,
to be issued and posted
He
up,
caused public
that if they would not
mandates and
apostatize
decrees to
from
be
Christ,
issued and
to
posted
persecute
up,
the Christians
that if they
everywhere,
would not
and to
apostatize
execute them
from
without
Christ,
mercy,
to persecute
with
the
every
Christians
kind of
everywhere,
torture that
and
could
to
be
execute them without mercy,
The torments
with every
with which
kind
the
of torture
Christians were
that
put
could
to
be
death in that
devised.
day were very
The
severe.
torments with which
They
the
were
poor
exiled,
Christians were put to death
spoiled
in
of
that
their
day
goods,
were very
sentenced
severe.
to the mines,
They were
scourged,
exiled,
beaten,
spoiled of their goods,
beheading,
sentenced
and
to the
hanging
mines,
were thought
scourged,
far
beaten,
too insignificant.
beheading
Yea,
and hanging
no punishment
were
at all.
thought to far too insignificant,
Hot
yea,
tar
no
was
punishment
most
at all.
invariably poured
them.
over them.
Hot
Roasted
tar
at a slow fire.
was most invariably poured
pricked in
over
the
them.
face, eyes,
Roasted
and the
at a
whole
slow
body
fire.
with sharp pointed
Stone
instruments.
pricked in the face,
Dragged through
eyes,
the streets
and the whole
over
body
hard
with sharp
pebbles
pointed
and
instruments.
rough stones,
Dragged
dashed
through
against
the
rocks,
streets
cast
over
down
hard
from steep
pebbles and
places.
rough
Their
stones,
limbs broken
dashed
in
against
pieces,
rocks,
torn
cast
asunder
down
with
from
hooks,
steep places,
rolled about
their
on
limbs
sharp
broken in
potsherds,
pieces,
given
torn
as a prey
asunder
and
with
food
hooks,
to the wild
rolled
beasts,
about on sharp
stakes
potsherds,
driven through
given
their
as a
loins.
prey and food to the wild beasts, stakes driven through their
There was
loins,
scarcely a place
etc.
where persecution was not in vogue.
There was scarcely a
Africa
place
and Alexandria
where persecution
especially
was not in vogue.
could be called the school
Africa
of
and
martyrs.
Alexandria especially could be called the school of
Nicephorus
martyrs.
says in his
In
fifth
short,
book, chapter 29, that to
Nicephorus
count the martyrs
says
of
in
this
his
time
fifth book,
would
chapter
be as
29,
easy as to
that to
undertake
count
to
the
count
martyrs of this
the
time
sands
would be
of the
as
seashore.
easy as to undertake
Well, I
to
will not go
count.
into all the names of
sands
the many who were
of the
martyred
seashore.
during this time.
Well, I will
There
not
are
go
two
into all
that I
the
will
names
mention.
of the many who were martyred during this time.
Babylus,
There are
pastor of the
two
church
that I
in
will
Antioch,
mention.
Syria, situated
Babylus,
on the river Orontes,
the pastor of the church at
beheaded with several
Antioch,
others
Syria,
from the church,
situated
about
on the river
254.
Orontes, and beheaded with
It is
several
believed
others
that this is
from the
the
church,
same church
about
that sent out Paul
254.
and Barnabas.
It is
and
believed
later
that this
Paul and
is the
Silas,
same
as
church that
recorded
sent out
in
Paul
Acts
and Barnabas,
13.
and later Paul and Silas,
Peonius,
as recorded in
pastor of the
Acts
church at
13.
Smyrna, nailed to a piece of wood
Peonius,
and burned alive.
pastor of the church
in
at
the city of
Smyrna, nailed to a piece of wood and burned
Let's consider
alive
the eighth
in the city of
persecution
Smyrna,
that began
about
under Valerian
254.
and his son Galen.
Let's consider the eighth
about
persecution. It
259.
began under Valerian and his son
Concerning this
Galen,
persecution,
about
Van
259.
Bragg recorded this.
Concerning
In
this
AD
persecution,
259,
Van Bragg
the eighth persecution
recorded
against
this.
the Christians
In
arose
AD
under the
259,
Emperor
the eighth persecution against the
issued an
Christians
edict
arose
against the
under
Christians,
the Emperor
in which he
Valerian.
commanded that the Christians
He
were not
issued
to
an
assemble
edict against the
themselves.
Christians,
And as
in
this
which he
was
commanded
not
that the
observed,
Christians
a
were
great
not to assemble
persecution
themselves.
arose everywhere.
And as this was not observed, a
Van
great
Bragg,
persecution
quoting
arose
P.J.
everywhere.
Twissick writes of the cruelty
Van Bragg,
and
quoting
violence of this persecution.
P.J. Twissick, writes of the
martyrdoms
cruelty
were
and the
manifold.
violence of his
They
persecution.
were cast
Quote,
before wild
the
beasts.
martyrdoms were
They were
manifold.
beaten, wounded,
They were
executed
cast
with the
before
sword,
wild beasts.
burned,
They were
torn limb
beaten,
from limb,
wounded, executed
rent
with the
asunder,
sword,
pinched with
burned,
red-hot
torn
tongs.
limb from limb,
Red-hot nails were
rent
driven in
asunder,
their fingers
pinched with red-hot
nerves.
tongs.
Some were
Red-hot
hung up by
nails
their
were driven
arms,
in their
and
fingers
heavy weights
and
tied
nerves.
to their feet.
Some were
And
hung
thus
up
were
by their
torn
arms
asunder,
and
gradually,
heavy weights
and
tied
with
to their
great
feet.
pain.
And
Others,
thus were torn
whose
asunder
wounded bodies
gradually
had been smeared
and
over
with great
honey,
pain.
were placed
Others,
naked in the,
whose
on the earth
wounded
in the
bodies
hot
had been
sun,
smeared over
to be
with honey,
tormented and
were
stung
placed
to
naked
death by
on the
flies,
earth in the
bees,
hot
and
sun,
other
to be
insects.
tormented and
Others
stung
were
to
beaten
death
with
by
clubs
flies,
and
bees,
cast
and
into prison
other insects.
until they miserably
Others were
perished.
beaten with clubs and
Under
cast
the reign
into
of the
prison
aforementioned
until they
cruel and
miserably
tyrannical emperors,
perished.
many Christians
Under the
had to
reign of the
wander and
aforementioned
roam
cruel
about
and
in
tyrannical
foreign
emperors,
countries, in
many
secluded
Christians had to
places,
wander and
along
roam
shores,
about in foreign
caverns,
countries,
on
in
mountains,
secluded
in
places,
caves,
along
amidst
shores,
want and
in
poverty,
caverns,
leaving
on mountains,
comfort,
in
honor,
caves,
prosperity,
amidst want
peace,
and
friends,
poverty,
money, and
leaving
property.
comfort, honor, prosperity,
mention but a
peace,
few names
friends, money,
under
and
this
property.
persecution.
I will mention but a few
Dionysius,
names.
pastor of
under
the
this
church at
persecution.
Alexandria, with two of his fellow believers,
Dionysius,
Gaius
pastor of the
and Peter,
church at
after
Alexandria,
much suffering,
with two of his fellow
exiled
believers,
into a desert
Gaius
place
and
in
Peter,
Libya,
after
3
much
days'
suffering,
journey
exiled
from
into a
Paratonon,
desert place in Libya.
Paratonim,
3 days' journey
about
from
260.
Paratonon.
They're spelled differently.
Paratonim.
This is
about
the country of
260.
Libya in northern Africa.
Though
that we
spelled
know
differently, this is the country of Libya in northern
Fructuosus,
Africa
pastor
that we
of the
know
church in
today.
Tarragona in Spain, along with
Fructuosus, pastor of the
Augurus
church at Tarragona
and
in Spain,
Eleugus,
along with
burned
deacons,
alive in
Augurus
Tarragona
and
about
Eleugus,
261.
burned alive at
Marinus, of
Tarragona
noble descent,
about
beheaded
261.
at Jerusalem because he
Marinus
refused to
of
turn
noble
from
descent,
Jesus about
beheaded at
262.
Jerusalem because he refused to turn
Priscus,
from Jesus
Malchus,
about
and
262.
Alexander, peasants, torn by wild
Priscus,
beasts, at
Malchus,
Caesarea,
and Alexander,
about 263.
peasants, torn by wild beasts at Caesarea about
In 264,
263.
P.J. Twissick records that 300
In 264,
lime
P.J.
kiln
Twissick records
because they
that
would not throw
300
incense on the
were
coals
burned in a
for
lime kiln
sacrifice in
because
honor
they would
of
not
Jupiter.
throw incense on the coals for sacrifice in honor of Jupiter.
Death with the sword. I surmise that he succeeded
Death with
Dionysius
the
as
sword.
pastor of the church at
I
Alexandria.
surmise that he succeeded
The time frame would be
Dionysius
right for
as
this to
pastor of the
happen.
church at Alexandria.
There were two others,
The
Florentine
time frame would
and
be right
Pontius,
for this to
that
happen.
are said to have been put to death.
There were
in
two
France,
others,
along with
Florentine
others.
and Pontius, that are said
Now
to
let's
have been
consider
put
the
to death
ninth
in France
persecution
along
that
with
began
others.
under Aurelian about
Now let's consider the
273.
ninth persecution that began under
Van
Aurelian
Bronk quotes
about
P.J.
273.
P.J. Twissick concerning
Van
Aurelian,
Bronk quotes
quote, Emperor
P.J.
Aurelian commenced the
Twissick
ninth
concerning
persecution
Aurelian,
against the Christians.
quote, Emperor
He was by
Aurelian
nature
commenced the
inclined to
ninth
tyranny and
persecution
was a
against the
furious
Christians.
bloodhound.
He was by
As
nature
Etrophilus
inclined to
writes,
tyranny and was
so
a
that he did not
furious
hesitate to
bloodhound,
kill his
as
sister's son.
Etrophilus
And
writes,
finally, through the
so that he did not
atrocity of his own
hesitate to
wicked
kill his
nature
sister's
and
son,
evil
and
counsel
finally,
suggested
through
to
the
him,
atrocity of his
he
own
became
wicked
an
nature
enemy
and
and
evil
persecutor
counsel
of the
suggested to
Christians.
him, he became
He sent
an
letters to
enemy
the
and
governors of the
persecutor
Roman
of
country
the Christians.
that they should vex the Christians.
He sent letters
When
to
he
the
was about
governors
to
of the Roman
actually
country
carry,
that they should vex the
out
Christians.
the persecution
When he
put
was
it
about
into
to
effect, he could
actually
not
carry
sign the decrees
out
which were to
the
be
persecution,
issued
put it
against the
into effect, he
Christians
could not
because
sign
God
the decrees
so that his
which were
hand
to be
was
issued
paralyzed.
against the Christians
That
because
sounds like
God
a
smote him
bad
so that
stroke
his
to
hand was paralyzed. That sounds
Through
like
divine judgment, he
bad
was
stroke to me.
terrified by thunder, lightning, fire darts.
through divine judgment, he
time
was
that he was
terrified by
constantly
thunder,
meditating
lightning, fire
how he might
darts.
slay and
At the
exterminate
time that
the
he was
Christians.
constantly
shortly
meditating
after,
how he
was
might
himself
slay and
killed
exterminate
by
the
his
Christians.
own notary.
And shortly after was himself killed
There
by
are
his
few
own
names that are
notary.
given for this persecution. This does not mean that
There are few names that are given for this persecution.
Records seem to have been
This
few
does not
that were
mean
kept
that it
during
wasn't a
this
terrible time.
persecution.
Records seem to have
Now
been
let's
few that
consider
were
the
kept
10th
during this
persecution
persecution.
began under Diocletian.
Now let's consider the 10th
Historians
persecution
record
began
that
under
between the
Diocletian.
Edict of 284 and
Historians
the Edict of
record that
302,
between the
many were
Edict
put
of
to death in
284
different
and
places.
the Edict of
Historical
302,
records indicate
many were
that there
put
were
to death
several
in
who
different
were tried,
places.
tortured, and put to
Historical
death
records
at
indicate
Agaia
that there were
in
several who were
Cilicia,
tried,
AD
tortured,
285.
and put to death at Agaia
In AD
in
290,
Cilicia,
others were
AD
tortured
285.
and then thrown to wild beasts at
In AD
Tarsus
290,
in
others were
Cilicia.
tortured and then
By all
thrown to
accounts,
wild
this
beasts
10th
at Tarsus
persecution of the
in
Christians
Cilicia.
by the Roman Empire
By all
was the
accounts,
most
this 10th
intense
persecution
and
of the
worst
Christians
of
by the
all
Roman
the
Empire was the most
persecutions
intense
up to that
and
time.
worst of all the
Van
persecutions
Brogg
up
writes,
to
or
that
quotes rather, a
time.
historian named J.
Van Brogg
Geisus.
writes, or quotes rather, a
Geisus
historian named
In AD
J.
302,
Geisus.
in the 19th year of his reign,
Geisus writes,
the
in
Emperor
AD
Diocletian
302, in the
instituted a great
19th
and
year of his
unmerciful
reign,
persecution
the Emperor
against the
Diocletian
Christians, which is
instituted a
called
great
the
and
10th
unmerciful persecution against the Christians, which is called the 10th
Salpidas
persecution.
Severus speaks thus.
Of this persecution,
About 50 years
Salpidas
after Valerian,
Severus
under the
speaks
reign of
thus.
Diocletian,
About 50 years after Valerian,
Maximian,
under the reign of Diocletian
arose a
and
most bitter persecution, which for
Maximian,
10 consecutive
there arose the
years
most bitter
ravaged
persecution,
God's people.
which for 10
At
consecutive
this time,
years
the whole world was
ravaged
stained
God's
with the holy
people.
blood of the martyrs.
At this
For
time,
men
the whole
hastened
world was stained with the holy blood of the martyrs. For men hastened emulsiously to these glorious and famous contents, that is, to martyrdom for the name of the Lord, and to obtain through a worthy and honorable death. The honor which belongs to a martyr was then sought with more eagerness than at the present time. Through a false ambition, men seek after a bishopric.
As through this,
Never was the so greatly depopulated
and never
as
were greater
through
triumphs
this
gained by us
persecution.
than when by those
And never
10
were greater
years of
triumphs
slaughter
gained by
we
us
could not be
than when by those 10 years of slaughter
This historian
we could
writes
not
that the persecution
be conquered.
extended all over the then known world. Asia,
This historian
Africa,
writes that the persecution
Europe,
extended
all
all over the then known world,
After he
Asia,
related the
Africa,
destruction
Europe,
of
and all
several
the
cities,
islands.
He began to name
After
several
he related
martyrs
the
in many
destruction
other places.
of several cities, he began
J.
to name
Gaius
several martyred
writes
in
again,
many
as
other
quoted by
places.
Van Brogg, many other
J.
cities
Gaius
had to taste
was
of
quoted
the
by
bitter
Van
cup
Brogg.
of this persecution.
Many other cities had to taste in their whole body the
Thebes
bitter cup
and Antino
of this
in Egypt,
persecution.
Nicopolis
Especially
in Thracia,
Thebes
Aquileia
and Antino
in Italy,
in Egypt,
where all the Christian
Nicopolis
believers were
and
slain.
Thracia, Aquileia
Florence,
in Italy,
Bergamo,
where all the Christian
Verona,
believers were
Naples,
slain.
Benevento,
Florence,
and
Bergamo, Verona,
in
Naples,
Gallia,
Benevitum,
Marsilius,
and Venusia,
Travis,
in
where
Gallia,
Rictionarius
Marsilius, and
proceeded with such violence and
Travis,
cruelty
where
in this manner
Rictionarius
that the blood
proceeded
which
with such violence and
colored
cruelty
many rivers.
in this manner
In
that
Germany,
the blood which
the
was
city
shed
of Augusta,
colored
and
many
even
rivers.
Spain, Britannia,
In Germany,
Rhytia,
the city
and
of
other
Augusta,
provinces
and even
were
Spain,
not exempt.
Britannia, Rhytia, and other provinces
Now in
were not
conclusion to
exempt.
part 8, with this persecution,
Now in
we will bring
conclusion
to
to
a
part
close
8,
the time period of
with
the
this
church
persecution,
at Smyrna.
we will bring to a
Jesus
close
said
the
there
time
would be
period of the
persecutions
church
10
at
days.
Smyrna.
And as we have seen,
Jesus said
were
there would be
indeed
persecutions
10
10 days.
of
And
persecution
as we have
that was
seen,
brought
there
on
were
the
indeed
Christians in
10
this
time
one
periods
alone.
of persecution that was brought on the
Persecutions would
Christians
never
in this
actually
one
cease.
alone.
They would not be as pronounced.
Persecutions
as they were
would
in the
never
Roman
actually
Empire.
cease. they would not be
Soon
as
the
pronounced
persecutions
as they
would
were in the
move
Roman
from the
Empire.
Roman Empire alone.
Soon
to
the
Roman
persecutions
Empire
would
through what
move
would
from the
soon become
Roman Empire
the Roman
alone
Catholic Church.
to the Roman Empire through what
Before
would
we
soon
continue with
become
Dr. Carroll's
the
Trail
Roman
of Blood,
Catholic Church.
we will consider the
Before
Church
we
of Babel.
continue with Dr. Carroll's Trail of Blood, we will consider the church at